For a discussion on the ASEAN macroeconomic growth and outlook and the risks it involves, it is an honour to have with us dignitaries from Malaysia, New Zealand, the Philippines. Key topics to be discussed will include where are the hotspots in Asia over the next 5 years, and what are the implications of US-China geopolitical trade wars on businesses across Southeast Asia. Please allow me to introduce the panel. High Commissioner, Malaysia High Commission in Singapore, His Excellency Dato Dr. Asfar Mustafa. High Commissioner, New Zealand High Commission in Singapore, Her Excellency Miss Joanne Tindall. Ambassador, Embassy of the Republic of Philippines in Singapore, His Excellency Mr. Joseph Delmar Yap. To moderate the panel, we welcome Managing Partner of RHT Law Asia, a regional law firm with offices in Southeast Asia, and he's also the Chairman of ASEAN Plus Group. Please welcome Mr. Azman Jafar.
A very good morning to everyone. My name is Azman. I'm the Managing Partner of RHT Law Asia. Our partners started this annual conference 7 years ago following the inception of our network called ASEAN Plus Group, which comprises leading law firms across Asia. Now, it is indeed a pleasure to be here on a lovely Friday morning, and a very warm welcome to everyone who has logged in to join us. This is the first time we're hosting the RHT CABA ASEAN Summit on a live stream broadcast platform, a solution developed by One RHT's partners, Rhodium Studios. Now, we're doing this for the 7th year in our 10 years of existence as a law firm, and the biggest challenge each year is how we're going to do the ASEAN Summit better than it was the previous year. The plenary session is often the most exciting segment of the day, as we will be engaging diplomatic luminaries from the region on a crystal ball topic: ASEAN in the new normal, advancing towards a more sustainable and resilient future. For the plenary session, we will take a closer look at some macroeconomic issues. It's about ASEAN development outlook and how we will navigate the pandemic across Asia. We will be looking at growth, outlook, and risk, and we are indeed privileged and honored this morning to have with us some very important people who have agreed to participate in the plenary session of the RHT CABA ASEAN Summit 2021. Let me introduce you to our guest this morning. On my left, from New Zealand, is Her Excellency Joanne Deidre Tindall, High Commissioner, New Zealand High Commission in Singapore. It's good to see you again, Your Excellency.
Good to see you.
On the left to Her Excellency is from Malaysia, His Excellency Dato Asfar Muhammad Mustafa, the High Commissioner, Malaysia High Commission in Singapore.
Thank you, Azman, for this opportunity, and thank you, RHT Law Asia, for this plenary event.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency Dato Asfar. Welcome to the plenary session. And of course, no stranger to our past ASEAN summits. May I introduce to you His Excellency Ambassador Joseph Delmar Yap, the Ambassador Extraordinary and Plenipotentiary, Embassy of the Republic of the Philippines in Singapore. Your Excellency, very good of you to join us again.
Thank you very much, Asman, for the invitation, and very happy to be here.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Now, before we start, as we do things nowadays, we have to flash the poll screen to you. You'll be seeing a QR code on your screen shortly. It's going to talk about ASEAN development outlook, navigating the pandemic. What are the macroeconomic issues which will affect your business in the next 3 to 5 years? Now, you can do this by way of a multiple selection. Please have a look at it and do your response quickly, and we will flash your response as quickly as we can get your answers. Then, of course, if there is a little bit of a delay, we'll show it to you a little later. Right, as we move along. let's kick off this discussion with some of the burning questions. There are a few, but they're all connected and they lead from one into another. Now, so much has changed over the last 1.5 years. The pandemic has changed our lives, and a lot more will change as technology and attitudes evolve over the next few years. Look at us today. Our conferences are evolving. The MICE industry is morphing into a totally different animal. The way we manage our work is changing. Remote work seems to be the in thing, and some businesses have gone under, and there are new ones emerging. Now, what can we predict will be the new opportunities that will arise in 2022? And in the midterm, what would the next 5 years look like? Which industries will survive or even thrive in the pandemic? There is also that recent announcement about the ASEAN Digital Economy Framework Agreement that will certainly allow for the increase in data flows. Now, I'm sure that each country might view or experience this differently. And if I may, let's open this discussion to our cozy little group here. So what are we seeing in the respective countries of our guests? Can I start with New Zealand, Your Excellency? What do you think about where the new opportunities will arise in 2022?
Well, thanks for that introduction, and it is really good to be participating in this event today in our cozy group here. I just wanted to start by acknowledging that while New Zealand is not a member of ASEAN, we are a dialogue partner, have been of long standing, and it is a very important relationship for us around the region. I think you're going to hear quite similar themes coming through from all your speakers today, perhaps with some nuances. From New Zealand's perspective, we have been champions of free trade. And I think in common with Singapore, we've got shared membership of 5 free trade agreements of various sorts. So the bilateral enhanced partnership we have is comprehensive, but with COVID as a backdrop for the world and the region, the priorities we are focusing on, some of them were already there, but they've been sharpened and the direction changed with the arrival of the pandemic. So from New Zealand's perspective, as a producer of food, agri-food, including research and development into sustainable alternative forms of protein, low carbon produced food is a particular priority. And freeing up regulation, particularly around the ASEAN region, to ensure food security and high quality, safe food can be exported. Climate change and sustainability. We've recently signed a hydrogen memorandum with Singapore, one of a couple of countries. So I think climate change and working together towards COP26 with mutual interests in green finance, renewable energy, energy efficiency and so on, that's another area of priority. The third one you've already alluded to is the digital economy. And even prior to the pandemic, we worked with Singapore and Chile on a digital economy partnership agreement, and it's great that ASEAN is also looking at the digital economy. Clearly, digital has really accelerated in an exponential way the move towards digitalization. The new thing, and the last priority I'll mention, is supply chain resilience. We all kind of took the way the world moved stuff around for granted prior to COVID-19, but in the last year and a half, we've seen that come under real strain and real concern that it is going to take a couple of years for the maritime shipping situation to, for example, come back to some state of normality. So that's a fourth area of concern, to work in cooperation with others, including and in particular with ASEAN, to ensure supply chain resiliency.
Thank you very much for your insights, Your Excellency. I think one of the interesting things about the a consequence of this pandemic is the fact that some of these things which were originally in the pipeline suddenly got accelerated because of how we were left with no choice but to think of another way in which we could do things a little differently. But at the same time, I think it's unfortunate that in many instances there were also consequences which arose from these accelerated developments. One of which will be if you like, the demise of certain industries, because as a result, some of these industries have become unsustainable and not feasible over the midterm to the long term, I suppose, depending on how this pandemic now will continue in our environment. As we move along, I'd like to invite His Excellency Dato' Azfar to give a little bit of your insight about what you think, whether you think the opportunities will arise in 2022, and how we look at the other issues for Malaysia.
Thank you, Osman. I think following COVID in 2020, now we are in 2021, I think we have seen some growth, in 2021, but the growth has been uneven across sector and across regions. Of course, I think in this region we are quite fortunate because we have been always an engine of growth for the world. So we continue to have that. For example, in Malaysia, our investment, for example, for the first quarter of 2021 have shown an increase of more than 100% compared to 2020. So this, I think for Malaysia, we'll continue to do what we are best at, that is to manufacture goods for the world. But of course, as you mentioned, there will be something that have to be brought forward, compared to the original plan. For example, digital economy, as Excellency Joanne also have mentioned, So for Malaysia, we have what we call, to make sure that the populations or the whole area of the country are connected. So we have a scheme that we call Jendela, basically digital connectivity for the whole region, Sabah, Sarawak and Peninsula. The whole idea is to make sure that when digital economy in the ASEAN are in full swing, then we are able to leverage on that development. The other thing, I think we will continue to focus on manufacturing, and of course the other thing will be to make sure whatever that we do will be sustainable in the long run. So we are also taking stock of, as you mentioned, some industry will probably no longer there after we move up, after we settle the COVID situation. So we are also looking into the manpower aspect of it, talent and so on and so forth. Because to make it to a local level, we have, for example, before COVID, we have about 300 to 400,000 people commuting every day between Johor and Singapore for them to work here. But of course, after COVID, some of this job will no longer be there, because industry in Singapore or even in Malaysia for that matter, they embark on digitalization, automations, industry 4.0 and so on and so forth. Some of the job will go forever. So we need, as a government, we need to think about how we're going to provide, jobs to this group of people that will, affected by COVID and so on and so forth. I think probably that's for this time, Azman. Thank you.
And sometimes I think it's amazing that when the world came to a stop, you suddenly realize that there were so many people commuting between Johor Bahru and Singapore every day. And we're not even talking about just the schools, we're talking about in the manufacturing sector. And when everything came to a stand, and we have Malaysian staff as well in our office, and some of them, and we recently sent one home because we were quite sad that he's not been able to see his daughter as a result of the border closures.
Yes.
So there are a lot of interesting human interest stories arising from all this. But I'd like to move this discussion on to Your Excellency Ambassador Joseph Yap regarding where he thinks the Philippines is managing this in terms of the opportunities that are coming up in 2022?
Thank you very much, Asman. The Philippines, from 2010 to 2019, our GDP growth averaged around 6.4% every year. So that has been actually quite a very strong growth track record. Unfortunately, all of that got sidetracked with COVID beginning in 2020. However, there are signs of recovery now. The second quarter of 2021, we showed GDP growth of 11.8%, which is our strongest growth in more than 30 years. So hopefully that with the slowly opening up of the economy, that the economy will recover. The major areas where we see growth coming is, of course, for us to be able to cope with the COVID pandemic. One key area that we need to do a lot of investment in the coming years would be in beefing up the healthcare system. So that is a priority of the government, and that is reflected in the priority areas for the upcoming budget for 2022, among which would be the establishment of a Virology Science and Technology Institute, which would be hopefully prepare us for the next pandemic that will be coming over the horizon. In addition, it would also provide funding for the local government to be able to provide the necessary support services for their population. The Philippines, the local government actually has many of the key functions of government are actually devolved to the local government, all the way down, in fact, to the city and even the village level. So it's important for the government to make sure that all of the different local government are able to perform their functions, especially with regards to healthcare and social support functions. So that's one major area. But in terms of the opening up of the economy, the priority has always also been to legislate new laws which would attract more investments to come in. And to that, for that purpose, a couple of laws were passed last year or the year before that on ease of doing business and create, which is the law that actually cut our corporate income taxes from 30% to 25% immediately, and then over a period of time to reduce it further to 20%. So the purpose of that is, of course, to invite more investors to come into the country. But some of the industries that we expect to continue in the new normal will be, prior to the pandemic, we were already doing a lot of investments in infrastructure. We expect that to continue. This is it's not a new direction, but it will be redoubled because obviously COVID has kind of slowed down the development of some of these projects. But that will fully be, the efforts will be redoubled. And then, of course, one key industry that we have, which is interesting for us, is that we have this IT BPO industry. It's the industry that does this business process outsourcing. So 50% of which is call centers responding to calls from customers. But the other 50% is really back office support for finance, in healthcare, insurance companies, and so on. This is a big industry because it employs 1.3 million Filipinos. And interesting enough is that because this thing works on the internet, it was actually not affected by COVID. So people could actually work from home, or even if they work in the office with social distancing, they're able to continue. So this was actually a growth industry during 2020. It grew, it did not shrink. And then, of course, as mentioned earlier, the areas that will grow definitely would be digitalization and e-commerce. One statistic worth mentioning is that a study made showed that prior to COVID, 2% of retail sales were done through e-commerce. But this year, another survey was made, and 78% of the population have at least done one online purchase in the last year. So that has really shown that digitalization and e-commerce will be really a new and upcoming industry.
Thank you, Your Excellency. But this kind of goes to show, how the acceleration in some sectors have, really dramatically changed and altered the way we conduct ourselves on a day-to-day basis. But at the same time, I'm kind of, mindful of the fact that, many of us used to travel quite frequently for our business, and the fact that we don't, and you're just wondering how the hospitality industry is doing, and of course by just what you mentioned, how the retail industry is doing, because I think malls are suffering in some areas, and I think it's no longer about just the kind of retail space that you will command in order to further your business. I think today it's a lot more than just that, and everyone else is also thinking ahead to see what's coming up over the horizon. I mean, even the retail sector, how much of it is going to change from just being an online sale to something else which may be a little bit more experiential when you buy something online. And increasingly, I think it's going to be a question of who's going to get there first. I'd like to see if any one of our guests actually has got some views about some of these edgy things where the world might be going. I mean, bearing in mind in all our countries, hospitality remains an extremely important sector. And with this going on, a lot of, for example, in Singapore, a lot of our hotels have become quarantine hotels for purposes of inbound travelers and so on. But for that, I don't think there's anything else, because there's hardly any travel. And when there's no travel, how much of this is going to change? How much of our malls is going to change? How much of how we even plan for office space is going to change? And that will certainly, over the next few years, alter the way our economic landscape would look like. Did you have any views relating to this?
I'm going to be a bit backward looking.
Okay.
I'm still one of those people who subscribes to the paper version of a newspaper, which I like to read over my morning coffee. So I'm probably not the best person to speak. I still like to go into a store to try on a pair of shoes and see whether it is actually going to fit and be flattering, rather than picking something online and having it delivered. I think businesses are doing an admirable job of pivoting and thinking in very inventive ways about how they can continue to provide hospitality, for example. But I don't think well, I'm hoping we won't see a wholesale move away from at least some of the traditional ways we maybe not the big sort of scale malls we had, but when it comes to experiential things, people want to be together. They want to go places rather than doing it all purely from home with a digital device in front of them. So all power to digital technology. It's helping us through, and it is keeping some businesses alive. You know, I'm from New Zealand, our borders are fully closed. Almost everyone I meet here is saying, when are you going to open your borders?
I'm going to ask you the same thing.
We want to travel to New Zealand, and I can tell you that our New Zealand hospitality sector, well, it's pretty reliant on domestic tourism at the moment, which at least we have the opportunity for, is equally very, very keen to be in a position to welcome people physically to our shores and not just reminder everybody how lovely the place is through videos and Instagram feeds and so on.
It's just not the same, I think. It's just not the same. Sorry.
Yeah, Azman, I think you raised a very important questions, about this, whether the brick mortar will continue to be. Of course, Excellency Joanne mentioned that she like to do that. I think some segment of population will continue to do that. But I think maybe this is where I can quote the reports by Google, Temasek and Bain and Company, about in 2020 there is a new 40 million internet user in Southeast Asia, So that indicates that, more people are now being on the digital platform. So with that numbers now, there are about 70%, population of Southeast Asia, 70% of them are not connected, So of course, the young ones, I think they are used to this technology, They like to buy things through even mobile phone, So my children, they always do that, But for me, I'm old school like Excellency, we like to go and try, to make sure the size are right and so on and so forth. Because, you buy digitally, then the other parts of the thing that you need to ensure is the supply chains, You need to get people to be able to send it to you, in an efficient way, and so on and so forth. So yes, I think there will be some changes to the way that we people buy and operate and so on and so forth. But I think there will be also sizable group that continue to wanting to do the thing as usual before COVID, and so on and so forth. So I think the challenge for the government is to make sure they have a policy that will be responsive to these two groups, to make sure those who want to continue to go to the mall are able to do it in a safe manner. With the health protocol and so on and so forth. And those who like to do it digitally, they are being enabled with the whatever connectivity and so on and so forth. So I think that will be the challenge for the government moving forwards, with regard to the digital economy and so on and so forth.
Your Excellency, do you have anything to add?
I have to agree with my colleagues. I think that particularly in the Philippines, going to the mall is really not 100% just for shopping. Part of it is really kind of like recreation, entertainment. Many of the people will go to the mall, spend the whole Sunday there. And the way we've organized it in the Philippines, you can actually hear Mass in the mall before you start your day. There are, in fact, some malls where you have several scheduled Masses. So you can actually attend Mass, then go shopping, have lunch with your family, go watch a movie, go play video games or whatever. Different members of the family can do that. And for those families who don't have air conditioning at home, this is a nice way to spend a hot day by going to the mall. So there is still that component that will be there once the malls open up. But currently, of course, because of restrictions, they are not able to do that. But I'm sure once the malls reopen, that will come back. Of course, those who have gotten used to shopping online will continue to some extent shopping online. No longer 100%. I have to say, for example, I did not shop online at all before COVID. Never in my entire life. But now I shop online for most of my groceries and things like that. So I hardly step into the supermarket, even though here in Singapore you're able to do that. Now on hospitality, I think like in New Zealand, currently the Philippines survives, the hospitality survives either on as a quarantine hotel or for domestic tourists. But again, I'm sure once the COVID restrictions are lifted and the borders are opened up more, there will definitely still be more people going for the hospitality and the shopping. The question really always is whether the hospitality industry can last, how long it can last, given that the COVID situation keeps on changing and doesn't seem to be going away anytime soon. So those are the challenges, I think, for them. But they will come back, I'm sure.
Yeah. Thank you, Excellency. I tend to agree. I think sometimes what we don't quite realize is that for everything new that emerges, there's always some consequence that occurs to something else. I read recently a report that going online isn't exactly green because it consumes a lot of processing power that your data centers are going to consume even much more simply because more people are going online.
Exactly correct, yes. And,
so it's not really a solution.
No, it's not. And data centers generate a lot of heat,
Yes.
Meaning they need to be cooled down. So certainly if we build them in hot parts of the world,
It gets even worse.
the energy consumption is higher.
Yes. But sometimes I also look at some of these problems in the context of, as a people, as a community, human beings, we have affinity for the many things that bring us together, whether it's at work, within communities, which I think there's always been the challenge of governments in trying to enable communities to still come together during this pandemic. As much as there are restrictions, they would always have to look at what you do at funerals, what you do at weddings, and so on and so forth. But at the same time, I think we're sometimes quite concerned about what happens at work, because the so-called organizational culture usually evolves from the physical workplace, without which it's anybody's guess how culture will then evolve. Because if you don't get to meet everyone, I wouldn't know. I would have an understanding of how people really are without having to meet them, because meeting people are multidimensional. You get a lot of experiences that feed into your mind, but when you see somebody online, you don't. But I think it also brings to mind about how some of these new lines of thinking is bringing about change in the way technology and innovation is being developed. I think I've seen solutions where concerts can go almost 360. So it's almost as though you're in the concert, but you put on a VR goggle and then you watch the concert as though you're there. So it's going to be interesting how the ever concert is going to come about. So some people are buying tickets already, even from Singapore, with no idea whether they can travel to London or not. So the other point I'd like to see if we can try to talk about or address is the challenge of slow-moving regulatory environments. And sometimes, in a physical environment, we can sometimes protect. In every country, I suppose there's always a certain amount of protectionism, which I think as a group we're trying to manage and move away from. But there's still a need to manage some of these controlled, or if you like, protected turfs within countries. There's also going to be the challenge of evolving the regulatory environment, or progressing the regulatory environment, as it were, when as a result of many things going online, there'll be many more rules and regulations that will be brought about by some of these changes, from payment systems to many other things. But it's always been said that the regulatory environments are always just too slow to catch up. And some people would say that, look, why don't you let them self-regulate? So what are your thoughts about regulatory environments not catching up with changes in the environment. Some people would just say governments, the bureaucracy would just take too long to catch up. And as a result, there's going to be a long state of flux before we get into some level of normalcy for any new technology to come into being. What are your thoughts?
Well, that's a big question. Any new technology has exciting opportunities, really good aspects to it, but equally there's always ends up being a darker side, a challenging side. And the whole digital sphere has been a prime example of that, with the philosophy behind the internet being well-meaning, and highly democratic, across the entire world, free access. But over time, obviously, difficulties start to appear. There are some things that I think leaving things to the market, we've discovered over time, is not necessarily a good idea. The market does not necessarily find the right way at all. There is a difference between regulatory policies that can be introduced a little more quickly, depending on your political situation, I guess, and stability of government at a national level. But when it comes to things that are global commons or things that are of regional interest, of course, the regulatory process takes more time. But that doesn't mean we should give up on it. I think it's really important that we be aware of the areas that do need to be regulated, and ensure that policymakers start thinking about it. The Digital Economy Partnership Agreement New Zealand signed with Singapore and Chile has some hard rules, if you like, in areas where it's possible to do so. In other areas, it's kind of established placeholders for the development through cooperation of standards or norms that will apply in those frontier areas like AI, digital identities and so on. What we're also doing is now starting to, again, prompted by the pandemic, to develop pilots for truly paperless trade. We discovered, for example, that there was a mismatch. Back in the day, you would sort of send the documentation that would need to accompany a shipment, or be needed for clearing a shipment by air. And it would be there in time for the ship to arrive and everything to be stamped and checked and everything. But with the disruption to the aviation sector, suddenly you can't guarantee that there are direct flight routes, or that you can sort of line up the timing.
Sync in time, yeah.
So the need for genuinely paperless trade has become much more acute, and it's an area that we're looking into. So I guess all of these, I know they take time. Believe me, I know. I've sat in multilateral negotiations for a lot of my life. They take an enormous amount of time, but they are worth the effort, even if the market starts to get ahead of them. We just, I think, have to be aware of trying to find that balance between allowing the market to operate, but also protecting the interests of businesses and consumers particularly in the digital space.
Thank you, excellent. I think in Singapore we do pretty much the same in allowing new ideas to develop, new systems to emerge. But at the same time, I think regulators like the MES and all that will play catch up along the way. And I think it's amazing how a lot of this have come about as a result of the need to actually catch up with the changes around us that occurs almost at a daily level. But what are your experiences, Your Excellency, Dato' Azman?
I think I agree with what Excellency Joy mentioned. But I think to go back to your questions, I think the challenge will be in the past when we develop regulations. I mean, relevant density regulation is mainly for national level, But when digital space come, then our producer, for example, or seller in one corner, very small corner of our country, are able to reach the world, So that when we develop regulation, we have that to bear that in mind, Basically, those who be going to complain is not necessarily just Malaysian, but those maybe from United States or even New Zealand, those who buy that product. So when that happens, then we need to talk to the other country in order to develop the regulations, So as you mentioned, it requires more time, and with no travel, it will become more difficult. As you said, something can be done through virtual, through
not everything.
conference and so on, but not everything. So interesting observation. I spoke to my colleague from MFA Singapore, in the ASEAN department. As Excellency Joanne, they used to have multilateral negotiation of ASEAN document and so on and so forth. So what happened now? Most of the meetings are virtual, but he basically leverage on the contact that he have made before, so that they know each other, so they can leverage on that understanding that they had developed over the years. But sometimes, people come and go, then the new player come in. So it's difficult for them now to have the same understanding, So I think the challenge, as I mentioned, in the past we developed regulation more. I mean, we can do it fastly because it's just meant for domestic. But now when we talk about any regulation, we have to bear in mind that this may have far-reaching, consequences to other countries. Then it compels us to work with other countries as well. Otherwise, there will be no means to the regulation that we are developing.
Thank you, Your Excellency. Sorry, you want to say something?
Yes. Actually, the regulatory environment always is a difficult task because you really need to regulate certain activities, but on the other hand, you don't want to stifle the growth of that industry. I think, but I'll have to agree, and they'll probably kick me out of the Harvard Business School Alumni Association for saying this, but I don't think that it should be left to the market to regulate itself. There is no such thing. I think other stakeholders have to be part of it, and the government obviously has to be part of it. So the advantage, I think, historically, it's not so difficult because industries develop slowly over time, and it's not suddenly sprung upon us. And then, so there's time to come up with the necessary regulations or just follow previous regulations and adapt it to the new industry. But of course, with the new digital age, this is not happening because the change is now so fast that there really is real danger that society and the government will be left behind by what's actually happening. I mean, I think you see part of what's happening in China with regard to regulations on technology companies is because of that. I think these companies have actually developed so fast that regulations is now catching up. So I think it's that's why I think this digital economy framework agreement that ASEAN is looking at will be a very important step, I think, to try to harmonize the policies of the different ASEAN member states as well as the dialogue partners to really come up with something that will facilitate the development of the digital world, but at the same time be able to rationalize and harmonize the rules with regards to data privacy, with regards to how to handle digital information and how to, but with the view of how to facilitate, still facilitate trade and the actual delivery of goods and services within the region. So I think it's still a very important initiative.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I think there's an interesting point all three of you made just now about the importance of the fact that many regulations today are multilateral. I mean, you're talking about you need to look for a set of unified rules so that we all know how to manage the entire game, if you like, across borders. But at the same time, given the situation today, it's actually very difficult to have virtual meetings all the time. We do that every day, and we know it can be frustrating. But at the same time, you mentioned about how people used to leverage on the old relationships they had. And it comes back to the same thing, that at the end of the day, perhaps the thinking should also be that as we now have to leverage on technology, we have to look for ways in which we can organize ourselves to augment that technology to work in our favor, as opposed to letting it dictate how we should work. So if I don't know you next to Adam and we have to negotiate on something, it's extremely difficult if you have to do this online. But then perhaps the thinking of many governments would be to think about how we can all then work towards achieving a better end game by ensuring that we leverage on the right principles, and this thing being one of them. And the other point I'd like to raise was that something very interesting about how we talked about data privacy and the need for some consistency in that in this approach, because about 5 years ago, when I had a conversation with a member of a think tank, he mentioned about the same thing. He said, as we integrate in ASEAN, a lot of it is going to be through technology, and a lot of this will require us to have very consistent data protection policies. If we all have very different ones, it'll be very difficult for the different member states to actually organize themselves as one. We used to say the ASEAN production base, if you like, and it's consistent with the thinking behind that. For a more expanded supply chain structure to now exist, you do need better integration amongst the member states. Otherwise, it really wouldn't work. Sorry.
Well, I would just note that there is an important difference between harmonization and interoperability or alignment. And it is the latter that is easier to achieve on a multilateral basis. You don't need everybody to have exactly the same
But you just need
rules.
to know how to operate with each
But
other.
they need to be able to connect and understand and kind of, yes, understand, as it were. And the other point I think is important is that increasingly we're starting to see multilateralism move into a mixture of hard rules and setting up bases for cooperation. And setting up those frameworks for cooperation can be just as important and less time-consuming than coming up immediately with a fully fledged set of rules to apply, whether it's regionally or universally or whatever.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Your Excellency. That's quite interesting. I mean, sorry.
I think the classic example will be the vaccine passport.
Yeah.
I mean, even for Malaysia and Singapore, for example, I'm vaccinated with Pfizer, and then Singapore only, vaccinated their population with Pfizer and Moderna. Then we still have to talk to each other to recognize each other, while, the vaccine basically come from the same source. Yes. Then our Ministry of Health have to talk to each other, and then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, we have 300, 400,000 people that are going to cross. Once the border is open, they're going to go back to this crossing. And then how do we find efficient way, for each other to recognize this type of thing, then this is where, as you mentioned, maybe not to harmonize, but to make it working to each other system, because we have our own, for example, My Sejahtera, Singapore have their own trace together. Then how do you connect these two apps, so that they can reach each other at least, to facilitate the movement. Otherwise, people will be at the border for 2 hours just to make sure that the digital certificate is being read. So, I mean, this is a practical issue going to affect a lot of people, and then how do we move about this, So I think that is one of the things that we have to do quickly.
Can you imagine? The other half of the problem is the fact that then two governments can actually trace everyone from both sides of the coast.
Yeah, and then they go back to the issue of privacy, as you mentioned,
Yes.
and how do we handle that?
Yes, and I think there have been several articles written that say that once these sorts of regulations have been introduced, it's very difficult for governments to basically take them away. They tend to hang around.
I tend to agree. Which is why I think we've always said that once new normal step into place, it's going to be a long time before you see it go away, because it's going to be embedded in the way we do our business. It's going to be embedded in the way we carry ourselves every day, how we interact, and so on. Today, it's not having our Trace Together app and so on, because it's just, everybody will be taking out their ICs, and it becomes a question of whether you carry the same IC or you don't, and so on. I think we will have a little bit of time at the end to see whether we need to revisit some of these points. I'd like to move the discussion into my next segment, which is about something very important to us in the region and important to all our +1 partners as well in ASEAN. And that's RCEP, or what we call the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Now, it was signed in November last year, and it's probably the largest trade pact in the world today. RCEP is a lot of things. It builds on ASEAN's existing bilateral FTAs with its +1 partners, and it brings together 10 ASEAN member states together with Australia, China, Japan, New Zealand, and South Korea. Now, RCEP, amongst others, actually regulates market access, deals with rules of origin, and it does trade facilitation. Now, what makes it interesting is also China's recent 14th five-year plan, which seems to mark a shift away from the quantitative growth focus of Beijing's yesteryears. It aims to usher in a more reflective mood, a more inward-looking, they call it a new developmental new developmental stage that targets quality development, which will drive their growth. It referred to an internal cycle that focuses on domestic growth as its engine for the immediate future. We have to ask ourselves as we progress this discussion, how FTAs like RCEP affect businesses in the region, given where we are today in the pandemic. Does it help where we think the market is going, where our bright spots are and opportunities are? How does China's 14th five-year plan change this outlook? Because I think as much as people started to, get excited over the fact that China is now inward-looking, but at the same time, it's not saying that it will only look inwards. I think it will focus on a lot of its domestic growth, but a lot of its domestic growth is going to be also, they're also going to be concerned about the resilience of their own supply chain, which will mean that some of the manufactured items in China has got to come out into the region before it comes back into China. And how will then geopolitics affect businesses in the region? I'd like to, see whether we can rotate these questions as we take them. So may I start with Your Excellency, High Commissioner Tindall, about what your views are?
So RCEP, yes, is a significant trade agreement with broad-based trade rules. It's strategically important to New Zealand. we individually or in other forms have free trade arrangements with every single one of the other 14 members of RCEP. So it doesn't in itself bring anything new. But the collective impact of having that group of countries together is of strategic importance to us. Already, I think, for our perspective, it accounts for, it's a destination for 56% of our exports and the source of over 60% of our foreign direct investment. So that's, significant from our point of view. And while there are a few new tariff reductions with respect to the current members, as and when and if, and we of course would hope that India at some point in the future might reconsider its position on RCEP. As new members come in, it gives that opportunity to negotiate improved market access to new members. With respect to China, I'm not going to comment particularly on the 14th five-year plan, but would note that very clearly China is not purely looking inward. In this morning's copy of the Straits Times, there was an article noting that China has put in a formal request to accede to the CPTPP. So another multilateral trade agreement. It's definitely, clearly not looking purely inward. As far as China is concerned, like most, if not all others in the region, China has very strong trade ties already with China. And we have an FTA with China, which was recently upgraded. So it's our largest single export market by some margin. And of course, we want to maintain those ties and opportunities like RCEP we see as allowing us to do so. The concern, I guess, is around COVID and the fragility and vulnerability of supply chains that has been exposed by that, and the susceptibility to disruptions. So from that point of view, arrangements like RCEP, the other bilateral and so on relationships we have with countries are assuming even greater importance, because we can see the need to look for market diversification to, I guess, shore up and mitigate against the risk of those supply chain disruptions that aren't looking likely to go away in the very near term.
Thank you, Your Excellency.
Yes, I think as Excellency had just mentioned, RCEP is, in Malaysia perspective, it's a huge thing, because as we all know, RCEP collectively will be 1/3 of world GDP, and of course, maybe, a third of world population as well. So it represents a whole market on its own, it's a huge market, and for a trading nation like Malaysia, this is particularly important. Of course, we also, similar to New Zealand, we have basically FTA with all the existing members of RCEP. But the other thing that important to note is that RCEP will be the first multilateral trade pact signed by China. And then, as Excellency mentioned, China has also formally wanting to be part of CTPPA. Then that also represents a huge, possibility for everybody. Because then you have another partner in terms of other economy that are not part of RCEP and so on and so forth. So I think the value of it is huge. Malaysia is looking forward, to leverage on RCEP to further, expand our economy and so on and so forth. Then hopefully, RCEP, will provide some clarity, because I think one of the issues that people discussed in the past is about intellectual property rights, But RCEP also have some elements of that contained in that. Then that probably will also, give some assurance to people when China is part of RCEP, Then people have more assurance when trading within this member of RCEP.
Thank you, Dr. Asfa. Sorry.
Like my colleagues, I think RCEP, the Philippines look at RCEP as a very significant multilateral agreement. We value the additional market access that it will grant to Philippine companies, Philippine products, and particularly to our MSMEs. I think the rules of origin will help our smaller companies be able to source raw materials from other RCEP member countries and then produce the final product for export. And as mentioned, I think RCEP countries are already receive 50% of our exports from the Philippines, and I think similar to Singapore, to New Zealand, we also get about 60% of our investments from RCEP member countries. And according to a study done by our National Economic Development Authority, they expect that the RCEP will generate an additional $60 billion worth of exports for the Philippines, additional by 2025. So in a relatively short period of time. On the Chinese economy, the Philippines has three major exports to China: electronic parts and semiconductors, mineral ore, and agricultural products. And we feel that the new 5-year plan of China reinforces the demand for these three products that we are producing. Although the initial, you would think that the electronic parts and semiconductors may be affected, but actually over the last year or more, because during the trade tariff war with the U.S., this particular segment of the Philippine export was not affected. Our exports to China of semiconductors was not affected, probably because the segment that we are working on was not one of the target segments in the tariff war. So we expect that the industries that China are pushing in their new 5-year plan will continue to benefit the Philippines' exports, plus, of course, the dual circulation economy that they will be emphasizing will generate more consumer demand, and there we hope to be able to tap with Philippine export of agricultural and food products.
Thank you, Your Excellency. I think it goes without saying that for a country like Singapore, it's a very small market. With something like RCEP and like New Zealand, I mean, we have FTAs with a lot of people, and I think it becomes important for us to always look beyond Singapore when it comes to our export markets, and also insofar as import markets are concerned, because we import a lot of what we need. And I thought one of the interesting thing about RCEP is that with Chinese 14th 5-year plan, it kind of opens up the Chinese market to the rest of us as well, because we previously looked at the ASEAN economic community as a market of 660 million consumers, if you like. But now if you add on China, potentially, it's quite a big number. I wonder whether your excellencies might have looked upon China as the inbound or the export market you're looking at in the way in which RCEP has actually made it so. Because otherwise, if you're looking at China as just a single market, for Singapore, you know that China used to be just the factory of the world. Whatever you need, China will produce. Now, whatever China needs, we may have to produce. And I think that brings about an interesting concept to many of us under the RCEP community.
I think New Zealand is a little different in that I think China's first free trade agreement, bilateral, was with New Zealand. Probably we were the guinea pigs for an FTA. But China had, off the back of that, rather rapidly become New Zealand's biggest single export market. As a producer of food and agricultural products, or the primary sector more generally, including forestry, logs, for example, China has been a massive market and remains a massive market for New Zealand even before RCEP. So I'm not sure that from our perspective, where we are coming from, we would be expecting to see any exponential growth. In fact, as I was saying earlier, from our point of view, it's really important for us to be thinking about making sure our supply chains, given our heavy emphasis on the primary sector for our exports, making sure our supply chains are resilient to disruptions. We're not a transit point like Singapore. We're not a hub. We're a destination. And it's very easy for forms of transport to decide they might just miss New Zealand out of the equation altogether.
I suppose at the end of the day, if it's not exactly the best thing to have if so much of your export is just going to one country. So much so that if that one country decides that we can diversify our imports by buying maybe 30% less from New Zealand, and that'll be a huge impact. There's a big impact.
Yeah.
Yes. Sorry, Dato'.
Yeah, I think China has always been one of our major trading partners, So for many, many years, it's either number one or number two, just interchange with Singapore, So, of course, I think RCEP will provide the opportunity, but how much, we cannot yet, probably quantify that at this point of time. But as you probably rightly mentioned, the Chinese market represent a huge potential, for anybody, and then as you mentioned, last time when we need something, China will produce for us, but now maybe the other way around, China may not produce everything now. They will be selective as technology and so on and so forth further develop in China. Then we probably will have to support them now, in order for them to produce a higher technological advanced product and so on and so forth. But I think Malaysia as a trading nation, as an open economy, will continue to play that role. We are probably almost similar like Singapore. We are in the heart of Southeast Asia, has always been one of the center for investment, for manufacturing and so on and so forth. I think for the next short term, we will continue to play that role. I think Malaysia remain an attractive investment place. And then I think that we will be used to leverage our role within the larger RCEP context, So I think that will be probably the way that Malaysia will frame our participation within RCEP.
Thank you, Dato' Asfan. Sorry, Ambassador.
The Philippines, like my colleagues, the Philippines' biggest trading partner is, of course, China, both in imports as well as exports. So historically, we've as I said, the three major products that we export to China. But more and more, I think, with the advent of e-commerce and RCEP, we hope that one of the beneficiaries will be our MSMEs that can start selling their products through e-commerce online to the consumer market in China. As we all said, China used to manufacture everything for everybody else, but now, as they try to develop their own domestic consumer market, and I'm sure the consumers will be looking for diversification of the products that they can purchase. The online purchase is one very easy way for them to tap into markets all over the world and be able to diversify the products that they can buy. So we are hoping that our MSMEs, and the government is working on, has rolled out a program which will assist our MSMEs in terms of gaining access to the internet and to digital marketing and all the services associated with it, to be able to market not only in the Philippines but also worldwide through online platforms.
Thank you, Excellency. Now, we're just going to take a short break as we have a look at the poll results. All right. So what are the macroeconomic issues which will affect your business in the next 3 to 5 years? You're looking at the largest is digitalization, technology and innovation. That takes top spot. The second spot is
COVID.
I can't see that.
COVID. It's not easy to read from here.
I'm not even trying.
Yeah.
The COVID issue.
Yeah.
The third spot is the US-China trade war, right, which we didn't really talk about. And then there's there are two which are at the global political stability and manpower and talents are shared the next spot, right? And then the last item shared the last two spots. Supply chain resilience and business mobility and travel. Okay, but it's I don't know. I thought that supply chain resilience might have been somewhere closer to the top, but I suppose COVID issue is actually a very broad topic that everyone would probably choose. Let's come back a little bit to the RCEP discussion. I think having seen that the outcome of the polls and then what we've talked so far, I'd like to take us to the last segment of our discussion, which is on the new normal, what it's going to look like. Everybody's talking about what concerns them. And of course, let me just tell the audience that if you've got questions, I think we will try to answer some of them towards the end, and then we'll see how that will work out in terms of timing. But as we look at the new normal and how it would look like given the poll results, and how we would actually address the issue of future resilience and sustainability. Many of you might not know that Her Excellency High Commissioner Tyndall was previously New Zealand's climate change ambassador, and I've specifically asked her to help us address this issue. So may I pass the podium over to Your Excellency here to say a little bit about what you think about the new normal and resilience and sustainability. How does all of that add up?
Well, hopefully it fits together. I think that, like COVID, climate change doesn't care about national boundaries. It's kind of irrelevant. So they're both global challenges that both require a collective response. And frankly, I think that while we're consumed by COVID-19 at the moment, what we're doing here will really, it's a practice run for dealing with climate change, which will dwarf what we've had to manage with respect to COVID. And I think it's really important, as we are trying to work through the implications of the pandemic and the pandemic itself, that we don't take our eye off the climate change ball. Governments have invested trillions, probably globally, some individual countries have invested trillions in trying to deal with the infrastructure issues that are associated with the pandemic. It's really important that we look both from a government but also from a private sector level to make sure that those investment decisions in infrastructure take climate change and sustainability into account. And what I mean by sustainability, or understand by it, is whether you're a government or whether you are a business, you are putting the planet and people alongside profits. So in New Zealand, for example, our government started to deliver an annual well-being budget. So the budget, rather than purely seeing New Zealand's health and economic terms, GDP growth, was looking at a much more holistic approach that took environmental and social issues into consideration along with economic ones. We're working on climate change and sustainability, even as we are dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic in New Zealand, and became the first country in the world to mandate a climate risk financial disclosure for our major financial institutions. We've put in place a climate change commission to advise the government on how to reduce our emissions and to set 5-year budgets, as it were, with the policies that will help to achieve it. You know, we were talking earlier about the regulatory side of things, and you mentioned vaccine passports, for example, and just how difficult it is, even on a bilateral basis, to get that kind of understanding about interoperability. So in COVID, we're in this awful situation where the WHO frequently talks about inequities around vaccines, for example, where everybody is going it alone, and there's a kind of spaghetti bowl of approaches and regulations being developed, which is extremely messy and is going to take a long time to tidy up. At the very least, on climate change, even though we started too late, we did manage to get slightly ahead of the curve by agreeing the Paris Agreement, adopting that in 2015. All of us are member countries. All of us have taken commitments underneath that Paris Agreement. So at least we've got past the starting line, and we've got a common set of rules that and agreements that we're working to. And that in turn, I think, that political signal has sent really important signals to the private sector, to big business in particular, about the need to price in climate risk, to take meaningful action and to think about climate change and sustainability in their long-term investment decisions, and hopefully It is getting down to the level of individuals. Again, you can see I read the newspaper over my morning coffee. There was another article today asking about attitudes towards climate change, and particularly amongst young people, but going much broader than that. The vast majority are deeply concerned about climate change and want their governments to do something about it.
And we can understand why. I mean, the young people are inheriting the planet since we're gone.
We don't want to leave them in the awful
yes.
mess it's looking like at the moment.
Exactly. And I think it's interesting that the pandemic, in a way, has gotten us to start thinking more deeply about this. I think the moment we saw how, for example, the drastic reduction of air travel brought about cleaner skies. The question is, how long can that last? And how deeply do we want to think about it? That's true, not long enough. And I think we, will have to quickly. I mean, if so much technology can be accelerated to deal with COVID, I'm sure so much more can be done to deal with climate change as well.
There's a lot that can be done with existing technology. And you mentioned planes being out of the skies, but cars being off the road. I think in major cities that suffer from significant air pollution, including in this region, it was literally a breath of fresh air for people during periods of lockdown.
I think sometimes we're also starting to look at the deeper meaning behind climate change and sustainability. Just because it's reusable doesn't necessarily mean it's sustainable. We're increasingly seeing that. So, and I think I'm mindful that even our government have started the Singapore Green Plan.
Yes.
We've jumped on the bandwagon, as I told you. We've recently appointed our own CSO, and we've started this policy called the Race to Net Zero, which we think we want to achieve by 2030. But okay, sorry, that's us. I'm sorry for talking about ourselves. But Dato' Azwar, so what would you like to add to this discussion?
You mentioned about new normal, after this. I think it will be a combination of the old ways and the new ones, which we adapt during this period of time, When I talk about climate change, I think this is also one thing that Malaysia has embarked on. I mean, of course, we have, as you mentioned, Paris pledge and so on and so forth. But recently, we passed what we call 12 Nation Plan, similar to China 14.5. We have 12.5 recently, and then a major part of it is localizing SDG 30. Basically, we want to implement all the commitment under SDG 30 into the plan to be part and parcel of embedded in the way that we want to do. And then central to it is also blue economy and of course circular economy. As you said, recycling does not mean sustainability. We need to look into the detail of it. But the idea is that to make the economy more resilient, to make things that we have now more sustainable in the long term, and so on and so forth, so that when times come, we hand over a better Malaysia to our younger generation.
Yes, that's true. Thank you, Dr. Azwar. Sorry, Ambassador.
Well, as you know, the Philippines is one of the countries most affected by climate change. So the government has taken it very seriously. A while back, we have a climate change commission, and there are many laws that have been passed. But I think it's interesting, it's good that quite recently the government banned new coal plants, and so there will be no new coal plants built or approved for construction. There are a few being constructed in the meantime. And I think there will be lots of changes. Private sector also has become more concerned about the green economy, and so people are switching to renewables, renewable energy, and moving away from the old energy. So I think more and more the leading companies in the Philippines are paying much more attention to their carbon footprint, and I think that's good, it will definitely be positive for the Philippines if climate change can be mitigated and we can suffer less of the horrible typhoons and floods that visit us annually.
There's an increased incidence of all that all over the world. It's quite frightening. Well, you know, we've had the session that we just had, you know, has been extended a little bit. So we've used up about, I think, a little bit less than 20 additional minutes just now, I think, to deal with some of the issues. Now, as you know, climate change, sustainability, the new normal, this is a discussion that we can have all the way through dinner, right? I mean, it's long, it's something like you could always do in a retreat, and, you know, over long breakouts, and, you know, we can talk about the future, and a lot of it has got to do with a lot of thinking, a lot of plans, and at the government level, a lot of policies, new regulations, and the vision for the future. And a lot of it has got to do with the planet we leave behind for our children. And I think that's an important thought, in a sense that for many of us, we can do very little for anyone else, but for our children, we'll do quite a lot, right? So I think it's comforting to know that the countries in the region, particularly ASEAN and all our +1 partners, are deeply invested in ESG, in sustainability, in ensuring that we tackle climate change at a multilateral level. And I think it's important for us to continue to do that. And I know then sometimes I have to bring ourselves back to the original discussion that this is actually about an ASEAN summit talking about trade and investment flows. Except that today, when we talk about trade and investment flows, we still have to talk about the things that will affect us in the end. Because you can have all the trade and the great investments that would flow in, but without climate change, it's going to be an empty planet by the time we're done. So with that, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Your Excellency High Commissioner Tyndall, Your Excellency Dato' Azfar, Your Excellency Ambassador Joseph, for your time this morning to share with us your views relating to how we would navigate this region in this pandemic, and where the bright spots and opportunities are, and in particular, you know, how we should be dealing with the issue of the new normal and sustainability in our part of the world. Thank you so much for your time. And I think with this, I'd like to end off today's discussion. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you.
We just posed.